Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies. Protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week, Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences patented technology protects any application against any attack with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences, demand more from your WAF. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Signal Sciences. With 84% of cyber attacks targeting the application layer, securing your software is more challenging than ever. Synopsys enables DevSecOps with a portfolio of industry-leading tools including Coverity, Black Duck, and Seeker to help you build secure, high-quality software faster. Synopsys is the leader in application security testing. Visit securityweekly.com/Synopsys to learn more. Make sure your team is prepared to fight off the latest cybersecurity threat. IT Pro TV is the resource to keep you and your IT team skills up to date. You can stream IT Pro TV courses live and on demand, so there's no need to send staff to off-site training. Team subscriptions include Pro Portal, so managers have full control over your team's training schedule. Go to itpro.tv/ASW and use the code ASW30 to try it free for 7 days and receive 30% off your monthly membership.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by John Kinsella. Register for upcoming webcasts and virtual trainings by visiting securityweekly.com, selecting the webcast training dropdown from the top menu bar, and clicking registration. In our first virtual training with online business systems, you will learn how to generate a complex SHA-256 hashed password and then use password cracking tools to break it. In our next webcast with Gradwell, we will cut through the marketing buzzwords and teach you about collecting and analyzing logs in hybrid cloud environments. Secure World Boston was scheduled for March 25th and 26th at the Heinz Convention Center. The event has been postponed until further notice. We will keep you in the loop as soon as we know more. This is our 100th episode, so I thought I'd take a look at what application security news looked like 100 years ago. In 1920, in Detroit, a police officer developed the first three-color traffic signal, thus giving us a 100-year head start on trying to solve that particular flavor of CAPTCHA. In 1920 in Tennessee, the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified, thus giving the need for election security a boost in order to protect the votes of not only men, but also women. And just to make a prediction 100 years from now, we'll see an IoT traffic light that allows self-driving cars to vote for the color they would like it to change to. And I'm sure it'll be vulnerable to cross-site scripting. So
probably less than 100 years.
Probably less than 100 years. I was being pessimistic, I suppose. But yes, I did want to say thank you, John. Thank you, Matt, even though you couldn't make it this episode, as well as all of our listeners for joining us for 100. And we'll hope to have many, many more hundreds to come. And speaking of very poor segues, John, we talked last week about Intel SGX. And I think you've got an update for us on that particular flaw within Intel.
Nothing but fun. It's the psychology of InfoSec is really interesting to me. So I think last week we were talking about the management engine, and my comment was, once people start getting something to sniff around, they're going to go and dig a little bit deeper. And that's what we're seeing now. So a day or two later, a story came out that people have found, and the SGX engine, SGX, I gave a really bad description of what it was last week, so my apologies. But what people are seeing now, people have figured out, is the secure Enclave, which is powered by SGX, which is used to allow applications to decrypt certain amounts of data if the signatures and the keys match up within that application and on that chip. People have figured out how to probably break out of SGX or get into SGX. And they can do it apparently from even just like a JavaScript application. So it's not quite the end goal, which I was talking about last week, which is someone's eventually going to get the keys out of the management engine itself. But once you get a few folks with some magnifying glasses on these things, they start finding more cracks. Again, I don't think this one is patchable either. But this is as we start talking more about cloud computing, things like SGX become more important. because we want to have some way of doing trusted computing of sensitive compute topics on those shared platforms. So it is something of note, something to really think about and do some research on before you start doing, really sensitive work in the cloud. But yeah, it's a moving topic right now.
Yeah, and I think your last point is a really good point too about threat modeling. None of this is predicated on saying SGX is completely broken, therefore the cloud is dead. And I know that's not what you were saying, but what you were actually saying is take a threat modeling approach. Understand what data are you putting into the cloud, what services and data will you be handling, and what type of security guarantees do you need for that, and do you have mitigating controls for those computing purposes. So basically take that relatively sane approach, a little bit of what we were talking about with Clint just in the previous segment, understand the context and the environment you're going into, and then react accordingly. Speaking of not reacting accordingly and for things that actually can be patched, do have an article about a data leak for a few million eBay and Amazon shoppers. And what stood out for me is not that this was yet another data leak, but two things. One, this is a data leak from a third-party service on the back end that was basically calculating VAT, value-added tax. I think withholding or analyzing the data or analyzing the shopping in order to figure out how to apply or what that would be applied to. So here is a legitimate business purpose, but a third-party company, or call this a supply chain for one of these sellers who needed to use this type of B2B service, but also something that was completely opaque and unknown to shoppers. So this isn't like eBay or Amazon has leaked these credentials. It is a third-party service that's done so through, I think, once again, an Elasticsearch service. But it kind of highlights that aspect of supply chain security, and not that just people are collecting data for data's sake. So this isn't data, for example, that necessarily is going to be turned into advertising. This is actually done for good payment and transactional reasons. And yet we still see a leak and a bad, unfortunate, and an unfortunate impact because of it.
Yeah, and you took the words right out of my mouth when you mentioned supply chain, right? And I think frequently when and this is sort of we've talked about over the last few weeks, third-party APIs, especially to start thinking more about microservices, serverless, IoT. We're going more and more towards this architecture where we control less and less of the code. And one of the topics we're seeing people talk about, at least I'm seeing pop up at a lot of the conferences now, is what's this shared responsibility between the cloud platform and the consumer or the people using the cloud. And this is sort of an example of that, right? You can go to a lot of trouble, think you're doing the right thing, and still you're not quite there. So back again to our, we keep talking about threat modeling today, and this is another example of, how do you do that? What standards do you hold your vendors to? It becomes this. We start moving a little bit away from really talking about technical and engineering topics to it's almost more of a legal or a policy or almost on the business side, right? How do you ensure that your vendors are themselves going to really high levels of quality around security? Is this something that your engineering team deals with? How much do they have to have this on their mind, or can they just trust that their vendor group, if they're large enough to have a purchasing team, the vendor team actually manages and runs through it? Does the vendor team know how to do pen tests or that type of thing with third parties? So it's worth a few conversations.
It definitely is, and I'd love to see actually toss this over to the Compliance and Security Weekly just to see where the overlap is with them and how they would approach the third-party risk and enforcing that. Looking back in my notes, this was actually a MongoDB, and that ties into what you were saying too, is how do you have this conversation with the engineers? Because in the previous segment, we were talking about with Clint, what are security patterns, or what are good patterns that engineering teams should be following? One of those patterns, for example, is authentication. And MongoDB and a few other NoSQL databases have been notorious for basically eschewing the need for any type of authenticated interface to deal with interact with the database. And here is one of those worst case scenarios where the pathological case happens, and not only is the MongoDB exposed to the internet, but it is indexable by search engines, which makes me think this is actually how the original researcher originally identified this particular data dump, because one of the search engines said, cool, MongoDB, let me just index it, cool, got all the data, here's nothing in my cache for anyone to come discover.
Yeah. You probably heard my groan. I'm a big fan of Mongo. Yeah. It's got a really bad rap around people leaving it exposed on the internet. I think there's some really great use cases for it, but you can't just go and leave the thing out in public. You got to do some of these things we're talking about. So, fortunate.
Yeah, let's go revisit some conversation with that engineering and that DevSecOps teams and how those conversations can go. But speaking of 100, we do have another reference to 100, in this case, a cool $100,000 earned by a Dutch researcher for basically demonstrating a container escape on GCP. So this is pretty cool for a couple reasons. One, we have a link to the write-up, and the researcher wrote a very simple and straightforward write-up of how they went through this particular container escape, starting off with a Cloud Shell instance, but also too the amount of transparency. And of course, for Google sponsoring, like many of the other big companies do, a bug bounty program to be able to award this type of research and basically fix these problems so they don't become more egregious or abused in a malicious manner.
Yeah, it's this one is I'm having a sense of deja vu. I'm still haven't read through the stuff behind the post, the meaty stuff. But did I hear about this one a few weeks ago, or was there a Cloud Shell issue on Microsoft as well? Does that ring any bells for you?
This work was actually done in December, if I'm remembering correctly. So you may have caught it from there. And we were talking about Azure Web Shells and a couple weeks ago with one of their Microsoft security write-ups, and they were talking about web shell attacks. So slightly different. But I'm trying to think. This was good information for anybody running Docker, or for those of you who are reading about Docker security or container security. This is just a good write-up to follow along and refresh. And either you are familiar with the straightforward techniques that were used to escape from the host into the or outside of the client to the host, or if it's something new to you. Speaking of containers, though, there was another announcement from Amazon about Bottlerocket, which is their new open source Linux-based OS that's purpose-built to run containers. And now there have been other stripped down or streamlined flavors of Linux intended to do this, but they've had various levels of support. CoreOS, for example, I think is one that is going to reach its end of life in May. So Bottlerocket is one of those that's probably stepping into the soon-to-be created void with a commitment from AWS to support it for at least on a 3-year cycle for the versions that go GA. But rather than the other thing real quick, and then I'll toss it over to you, John, is that this stood out for me that I really, really liked, is that they do a lot of things that are security minded. One is that the upgrade is just a pure OS upgrade. There's no package manager. So upgrade is an all or nothing, which is pretty nice. So that just makes things easy. And the other thing, there's no SSH. They do have a admin container, or basically a container D side channel that you can go through, but they've basically set up the expectation is that no SSH, no interactive shell. You shouldn't be mucking about with your containers anyway. They're supposed to be immutable or invariants, And if you need to change them or do a redeploy rather than go mess about within your production environment.
Yeah, I'll have to spin up a copy of this and play with it. The reason I say that is my spidey sense went off when I had heard that there was no SSH in there, but once you say that they've got a side channel with containerd, whatever it is, I start wondering exactly how well that's done. But so my core, hey, hello Freud. My core thought when I first saw this is CoreOS, and yeah, CoreOS is not being supported by Red Hat anymore. It's been forked into Flatcar. So why not throw your engineering dollars behind that? I like, and I'm a big fan of CoreOS and happy for those guys over at Red Hat. It's been a little depressing seeing them pull back out of some of the security lists what they used to be on. But yeah, anytime I see a new project created from scratch, I always think, why? And I'm very excited to see Amazon or AWS in particular actually doing more open source stuff out there instead of just, how will I say, borrowing and making money off open source of other projects. So that all those type of things are good, but I still go, why? I'm not really sold yet on this idea of not having a package manager. It might make sense. It's just something to wrap my head around. I mean, all sorts. It's our previous lives. How do you do asset inventory when you don't have a package manager? Okay, you got to do MD5 sums or something else, or do you want vulnerability scanners on there? It's all sorts of different things. So it'd be interesting to think about how this is going to play out. And it's not so much as, I'm not a vendor anymore, but there's a lot of companies out there that they have to have the checkbox of you need to have a vulnerability scanner that's looking for vulnerabilities. So how do they get into a product like this?
Yeah, it'll be interesting. And I think one of the phrases you might have been looking for from history is embrace and extend for open source projects. But in this case, it's definitely between Flatcar, Bottlerocket, and others. It will be we'll have to keep an eye on this, just how they develop, because I'm going to keep referring back to the previous segment to try and tie everything together. But yes, asset inventory either becomes maybe a little bit easier because we just know what version of the entire golden image are you running, or it potentially exacerbates the problem by making it harder to inspect for very particular dependencies or very particular vulnerabilities that might be present that do need to be updated or addressed, especially as the container becomes slightly adjusted to accommodate whatever application layer code that you need to run on top of it.
Yep.
So I had, there were a couple more articles I want to jump back to because you start off on a really good discussion about supply chain. I pulled an article from Microsoft. This is, they've been doing a pretty good series about supply chain attacks, and their latest one is good about how they're pointing about how supply chain attacks occur, and they call out a few a few news articles from 2012, 17, and 18 about Flame, CCleaner, and Operation Wiley Supply, if you want to dive into just some background of what that looked like. It talks a little bit of how the supply chain attacks happen or maintain persistence, if you will. But then it also does pull into what can you actually do. So it does have that apply slide section of an article that points to a couple things like the OWASP software assurance maturity model that we talked about a few episodes ago. Microsoft's own SDL, as well as linking to the NIST has some NIST cyber supply chain best practices as soon as I get my tongue twister over the word cyber. But there's some good things that companies can follow along here, but they do tend to fall on to more of that kind of policy and legal and vendor management aspect, I think, John, that you were alluding to, more so necessarily directly. Here is a list of a couple very direct pen testing or engineering or technical controls that can be applied to it.
Yeah, and it's I hadn't seen the NIST doc before. On cyber, I have a hard time with that word too. Cyber supply chain best practices, but is it the second point? Yeah, cybersecurity is never just a tech problem. It's the people, processes, and knowledge. And it's the reason it's sort of sticking to me and catching is, I think a lot of us got into InfoSec because we liked the engineering side of it. There's always the cat versus mouse type thing, but there's a lot of really hardcore engineering problems in there. How do you secure something which someone else didn't write right? How do you do this at scale? How do you do all these, the vulnerability management, different things? But a lot of it really comes back to the human side, and I think that's it. That's why it's interesting to me. We get stuck in our little space, but remember, it's another form of social distancing in a way, if I dare use that phrase today. So yeah, there is some good stuff in this paper in the Microsoft doc. A lot of it is, I'm going to say something stupid. A lot of it is common sense, but a lot of our industry is common sense. But it's good sort of, if you need not quite a checklist, but sort of a pretty quick read. This is a pretty short blog post that Microsoft did. Some good stuff in there, yeah.
Yeah, the good stuff. And, I'll give you that +1 on the common sense, but it's also can keep components up to date is one of the recommendations, which is just the same as patch your systems, which, one of those things like asset inventory, a little bit easier to say than execute on at scale, just because the complexity of dealing with a large scale or complex systems becomes a little bit harder just to keep track of. And the only other thing I did want to highlight that also riffs off that idea that it's as much a people problem is having an incident response plan. And the sense both of, if you get a report coming in from your bug bounty program, hopefully this wouldn't fall into your $100,000 payout, but who knows? But you need to be able to handle it from that perspective. But also, you just need to be able to know about it in the first place. And this is one of those challenges: is that if you aren't tracking what vendors you use, or even tracking even if the vendors are being good participants, good citizens within the the security ecosystem by being relatively transparent about vulnerabilities that are disclosed or doing notifications to their consumers of their systems, that's an interesting and harder problem to solve, because it's very much about communication and looking at those impedance mismatches between one company's notification and security maturity, for that matter, versus your own.
Yeah, and I think it's worth repeating again. Sorry, I'm looking at the other docs on there. One of the reasons we're talking about this, and I think the reason it is of interest to us now, is, as we were saying before, is as we're moving away from that really older school monolithic, we wrote everything in house. As you depend more and more on those around you, that's when this type of thing becomes really important. So I think supply chain management has obviously been around for a long time on the physical side, and it's been around in our neck of the woods, for the last few decades as well, with open source and everything. But I think it's really starting to escalate how much this is important to folks. The doc I was looking at, just to I wanted to mention to folks, it is probably one of my favorite in this list, is the Microsoft Secure Development Lifecycle. So that link sort of goes through at a high level. For those of you who aren't familiar with an SSD, what I refer to as an SSDLC, Secure Software Development Lifecycle, this gives you 12 bullets, little paragraphs for people to think about.
Yeah, and those 12 practices, definitely something that we could spend a year on, just 1 month on each of them, going from threat modeling to security requirements to supply chain and vendor security. So that will give us episodes 200 through 212 at least. So we'll do some more research and reading. But getting closer to the end here, there were 2 other articles that were going to take a little bit of a shift, but I think bring us back around to something interesting. Very briefly, there was an article on DevOps.com about the DevOps sweet spot, and it was basically saying inserting security at pull requests, and it's part 1 of presumably what will become a few more articles. But primarily, I like this idea because it ties back to that idea of putting the information signals, in this case security signals, where developers are going to see it. Because not only does it help them, and when Clint was talking about the company and the developers, the engineers that were using the fuzzer to say, oh, cool, this is actually just helping my code be more correct and more robust, and it just so happens it's fixing security. But you're also giving those signals back to the developers who ostensibly caused the problem or committed the bad code, so that they also then are the ones who know how to fix it, rather than trying to find it much later on in the process and then figure out who owns this code, who made the commit, reassign the commit to them, and it kind of becomes more of that task. It becomes more task management the more you move away from that immediacy of the pull request. So I liked it for that reason. And I wanted to use that to tie into this last article that's about security metrics that matter and those that don't, because I'm kind of curious if you've had a chance yet, John, to peek at this article, because I'm not sure I fully think these are even metrics really well fleshed out at the moment yet.
I did not, because I think this one was behind a paywall. Not a paywall,
right.
but a login wall.
It's at least behind a login, if not a bunch of advertising. So while I subject poor John to figuring out how to get through all of those items, the 4 metrics to ignore were things like number of attacks received, or the number of patches completed, or the number of vulnerabilities identified. I think these are all good. I like the idea of ignoring these because it just means you were busy. It doesn't really mean that you applied 100 patches or this is what Patch Tuesday looks like for Microsoft. It more is how quickly were you able to meet the SLA for patching, and how hard was it for you to patch your environment? Meaning, did you have high confidence that the patches didn't disrupt something else because you have good security testing as well as good acceptance testing, good feature testing, and so on? I think those are the types of things, metrics to focus on more. And 2 other things that I did like were mean time to recover, mean time to detect, as it relates to either bugs or incidents, security-minded incidents. But then it does talk about penetration testing and vulnerability management, but doesn't really say what the metrics should be around those. The same with phishing. It says looking at the results of phishing attacks as a metrics, but it doesn't quite say what's being done. And there, well, I'm going to keep talking while I burn time and give John a little bit more time to read and then chime in with some of his own opinions. Just saying that people are susceptible to clicking or opening a document, I don't think is a very informative metric. It should be much more of, have you designed your environment in a way so, like Clint was saying, you're opening links within Google Docs rather than downloading them to your system, or opening attachments, I mean to say, or your links are always being opened on your version of the web browser that is auto updates are enforced and being checked on a very consistent basis as part of your Beyond Corp or your single sign-on environment setup, so that people actually have to have an up-to-date browser before they can even log into their email. So those are the types of metrics in the sense of how can you defeat a class of a particular phishing vector rather than just say, stop clicking on that link, because there's no such thing as that evil bit in those links. So with that, John, I'm going to throw over to you and hopefully not put you on the spot.
I still haven't logged in. I actually don't have a login for the site, but that's no totally okay, because I get what we're talking about. And there has been some pretty good stuff over the years about like what are good metrics for InfoSec. And I think where the problem really comes from is when people either the boss or usually probably the boss's boss wants a pretty picture, something to look at the wall back up here of like what my graph looks like. At that point, people start to freak out and start digging for things quickly. And what might have been an interesting sounding metric years ago, like the patch management one, right? That has absolutely zero value when it comes to containers. How do I can tell you've got 10 million patches you need to apply today. Those containers are going to be gone in 20 minutes from now. It just makes no sense at all. And it takes, you want to have something of value to show people that both your org is doing a good job for InfoSec or AppSec, but also that your company is secure and that line is either staying, let's see, level, if I go that way, or going down. But it really requires taking a step back and probably having a whiteboard with you and 2 or 3 of your coworkers or buddies or older Application Security Weekly podcast episodes to figure out what are those things we really need to, what really shows concrete value about what provides concrete value about what we are about the value we're bringing, not the value I'm talking since I can't, and then also the value of what's the security of our organization. So how do you really show that value? And it might take a little more work, but the end result hopefully will not just be better understood, but when you see that going in a different direction, you're actually getting buy-in to do the right thing to make things better. So there's a ton of stuff on this. There's books written on security metrics, data visualizations. I don't have my library right now, so I can't point at stuff. But yeah, so Metricon is a really sort of under the radar sub conference, happens usually during RSA. There's amazing white papers comes out of this. If people want to go a little bit further, Monitorama is a conference which happens in, I think, Portland every year. Hopefully I'll get a chance to go this year since it's close to me now. Just really amazing talks on around monitoring. How do you monitor? What do your metrics look like? What do you do in Grafana? What other product you're using? So yeah, it's a lot of folks really geek out on this stuff. So don't just go for the simple. That's my 2 seconds on this topic.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic 2 seconds, and because I'm glad you mentioned Metricon, which it does go along on during RSA, and Metricrama I wasn't familiar with, but now I'm going to have to check it out because the metrics and visualizations too is another thing that really I perk up at because that's communicating these metrics effectively. And this article was about how do you essentially communicate metrics to a board. But if we're also thinking back to what we were just talking about with supply chain, how would you also communicate important and concise metrics to another company to convince them that, yes, we can be trusted with your payment VAT analysis data in our MongoDB because we have these particular practices in place, or for that matter, or if you're on the other side of that company, what kind of probing questions would you ask to try to tease out those kind of failures or the lack of maturity or that lack of really informative types of metrics. So all in all, I think that is there are good ways to take advantage of this.
Yeah, that's another really interesting topic. I know there's been some, how would I say, information sharing houses that are you have to, give a little bit of your blood to get in that list and then, you don't tell anyone else and that type of thing. But being able for companies or usually government orgs to be able to share data if they're of known vulnerabilities in different large orgs, but doing something like that for, what's the phrase I wrote down? Communicating metrics between partner companies. Yeah, that could be pretty interesting, huh?
No, very interesting. And so I want to thank you, John, for bringing up that topic and reminding me about metrics, because we're definitely going to have a dedicated episode on that at some point in the future. I want to thank everybody for listening, and thank you again for getting us up to episode 100. So thank you again. Woo-hoo! We'll see you next week on Application Security Weekly.